main event. We have, as we've said, some incredible authors in this essay series, and so glad that 4 of them were able to arrange their schedules to be with us this afternoon. So let me quickly introduce the authors, thank them once again, but now publicly, for hanging in there with us. This was a years and years long process, and they showed incredible patience and perseverance, even as the project evolved, agreeing, for example, to have Q&As be a part of it. And we're so glad you were willing to do that because it really added to the final product. If you want to learn more about them, please go to the website but I'll give a quick introduction right now. So Sandra Samuels is with us, and she is the president and CEO of the Northside Achievement Zone in Minneapolis. If you don't know about it, please get online and learn about it. It's one of the incredible things out there in our country fighting good fight. Sandra's essay was called Community Leadership in a Time of Trauma and Crisis. We also have Michael McAfee with us, one of the most strident voices out there for change. If you haven't heard Michael speak, buckle your seatbelt. Seriously, so glad you're with us, Michael. Michael is the CEO of PolicyLink, and his essay was called Winning on Equity. Michael, good to see you. We also have Tony Eiton with us, and Tony, it's a pleasure. I'm meeting you in person for the first time, or at least by video, but I've so enjoyed knowing your work and the contributions to the essay. Thanks for being with us. Tony is the Senior Vice President at the California Endowment, and his essay was called Shifting from Technocratic to Democratic Solutions, a Radical Vision for Health and Racial Equity. As you can see, our authors took us seriously when we said, try to be forward-looking in what you wrote about. And last but certainly not least, especially in an environment where we're talking about the next generation and passing the baton, Austin Balali Thompson, we're so glad you were a part of this effort, persevered with us, might have actually been the first author who agreed to be a part of this essay series. So Austin is the former executive director of the Youth Engagement Fund. He's currently working to promote digital inclusion at SpaceX. And his essay was called Mobilizing Youth Movements to Achieve Equitable Outcomes for Children, Youth, and Family and Communities at Scale. Sorry, children, families, and communities at scale. We have 2 authors who weren't able to join us tonight. And in fact, Bob Sege might be joining a little later, but I think he's teaching class right now. One is Jara Dean Coffey, and Jara is the director of the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. And her essay is called Values, Voice, and an Equitable Vision of Validity. An Equitable Vision of Validity. So check it out. And then we've got Bob Sege, Robert Sege. He's a pediatrician at Tufts Medical Center and a professor of medicine at Tufts School of Medicine. And his essay is called Balancing Adversity with Hope, Reshaping Policies and Systems Around Positive Childhood Experiences. So I hope if you have not seen those essays, that gets you interested. And if that won't, this next conversation, I think certainly will. We're going to jump right in, probably just take about 30 minutes for this conversation. And we looked across the essays and have identified 3 cross-cutting themes that really appear in each of them. And those are, number 1, the need for structural reform. Number 2, the need to center power building. And number 3, leadership and the next generation of leadership. So we're going to see if we can get through all 3 of those themes in the time that we have together. And let's jump right in on structural reform. Here we are, all living through a time of extended crisis, whether that crisis be the pandemic as it shifts and morphs, whether that crisis be the economic deprivation for the most vulnerable among us, particularly people of color, or rising violence in our cities. All of these forms of crisis. And Sandra, you spoke to this directly in your essay and your Q&A, and you called for the possibility of using crisis moments for transformation, transforming in crisis, as you called it. And I'd love for you to kick us off by talking a little bit about what that means to transform in crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And it's so great to be with everybody today. I feel so honored, and I just want to say thank you to the Richmond family for sharing Harold. I feel like I met him. I didn't. And but certainly his his legacy lives on. And so thank you so much. Yeah, so I am president and CEO of the Northside Achievement Zone, and we're here in North Minneapolis. And my organization is a collaborative of organizations. We're the backbone. We work with about 1,000 families, 2,000 students, 0 to 18. Our goal is none of us can do it in silos: housing, jobs, early childhood schools. And so we've actually come together and really created a for real village to surround the families and children who need it most. And I say, you know, Minneapolis, because we started this because our community was in crisis. There was structural racism and isolation that had mired my community. I live here in such disparities, right, and disadvantage. And we've been crying out from the wilderness for a long time. And then, you know, we had COVID hit, which pulled the covers back even more on disparities. And then we had the murder of George Floyd, which was no surprise to me that in all the cities, that kind of egregious murder would not have happened here. It made absolute sense to everybody who was Black and brown because of, again, the iceberg of racism. And anyway, and that was just a tip. So we can talk about all the other things as well. But we found that, you know, we couldn't do business as usual. And, you know, they say people change either because of great love or great suffering. And our transformation was definitely out of the great suffering. And the main thing that happened is we responded to the needs because we're place-based on the ground, and we could respond to the emergency in real time and the way our families and parents were shifting, our children and families.
Thank you, Sandra, for setting us up that way. Michael, I want to turn to you next. You are super clear in your essay. This is not a time for charity and incrementalism, much as we certainly need to make sure that those in need are taken care of. You call for, this is the time to lean in to radical imagination about how we restructure society. And I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. You know, for the last 20 plus years since I've been in this work, we've rarely talked about the design of the nation as part of the problem. We've simply asked nonprofit executives to clean it up. And as I work with Sandra and others and listen to Tony and Austin, and we know we can't clean it up, and we need to be honest about that. You know, the oppressive ways in which this nation operates at a scale that dwarfs our work. And we need to just be honest about that. Don't ask me for return on investment when you're going to allow children to be poisoned with lead-based paint. We know the epigenetic effects of stress. We know what toxic stress does on folks. We know what lead does on cognitive development as one example. So if you're going to poison an entire city by not replacing pipes as an example, it's quite unfair for us to ask the nonprofit sector to try to improve third grade reading levels or ensure that children can enter school ready to learn. It's a Herculean task, and while we'll do our best, it will be insufficient because of that structural barrier. And that's what you really hear me saying, is that absolutely charity is needed, but we can also hold greater complexity. Our democracy always extended an invitation, even though originally it wasn't intended for me, and that invitation was for us to continue to perfect this democracy. And we've never necessarily owned that, especially those of us in the equity movement. But we have to own it. We have to step into our power and own this nation as long as we're going to be here. You know, as the nation becomes a nation of color, there's no guarantee that we're going to get it right if we don't have a consciousness about wanting to own this place and make it better and to govern for the all in the equity definition. And governing for the all in the equity definition is the thing that this nation has never done. It wasn't designed for the multiracial democracy that it has. Its institutions weren't designed for that. So we keep asking it to do the thing that it was never designed for. And that's the work for our generation. You know, Gardner always asked us to think about self-renewal as a way of strengthening society. And that's what I'm talking about right now. The beautiful opportunity to renew our customs, our laws, our regulations, our institutions, even our own consciousness about what does it look to see each other's humanity and to design a just and fair society for everyone.
Thank you, Michael. It's a perfect segue to Tony. Tony, Michael talks about the oppressive realities of our society. And you introduced me and many of the rest of us to a term, policy violence, as a way to describe those oppressive realities. I'd love for you to say a little bit about what is policy violence, and then maybe get a little more concrete, right? What does that mean in this moment if we're going to be about restructuring society?
Yeah, wow. Following Sandra and Michael on this, and being in the presence of the Richmonds, and just feeling gratitude towards you, Mark, Leela, and Frank. I got to find my thoughts here. So let me just say at the outset that I think the ability to see structure in society is not something that a lot of Americans have. We take for granted as natural certain policies and institutional configurations, and we don't recognize that these are very unnatural configurations. I had the privilege, I guess, of growing up in Canada. And despite being an American, I was born here, I grew up in Canada, and I came to the United States at the age of 22, and I was landed in East Baltimore, Maryland for medical school. And I couldn't understand what I was seeing because the structural components were so obvious to me. We had a hospital that was divided in half between private and public. The public side was black, the private side was white. We had a community in East Baltimore that was just absolutely bereft of opportunities and amenities. And then just a few miles up the road, you had mansions sitting up on these grassy knolls. And I couldn't understand what I was looking at. I literally had no idea of how this could be the norm, how this could be the status quo. And so I think having an outsider's view has always sort of facilitated this idea that this is not the way it should be. Whereas oftentimes when I talk to some people who've grown up in this sort of environment, they just sort of take it as a given. So the concept of policy violence was something that I first heard from Reverend Barber in North Carolina around the Poor People's Campaign. And we were preparing a conference at the American Public Health Association. We were inviting Reverend Barber to come. He ultimately couldn't actually come. But the conference was around the idea of sort of public health and violence. And I was dismayed that the focus was really on interpersonal violence, and there wasn't any real focus on state-mediated violence. And so I introduced this idea of having some focus on policy violence based on what I've heard Reverend Barber talk about. And policy violence, in a nutshell, is the absence of affirmative policy in the face of abject need. It's the absence of universal health care when you have millions of people in the United States who die prematurely for want of reliable access to health care, and no other Western industrial society is configured in that way. We assume that this configuration is somehow natural. It's very, very, very unnatural. It's the absence of paid sick leave, never mind in a pandemic, in regular daily activities where people get sick and have to make a choice about whether they lose income or go to work and risk exposing their colleagues to whatever their illness is. It's the absence of universal pre-K when study after study talks about the critical developmental moment that young children are in and how poverty and stress changes the brain. It changes the actual physical structure of the brain. We know this, yet we lack policies that support a universal preschool, et cetera. So those are just some examples of policy violence. It's the absence of affirmative policy in the face of abject need. It's knowing what to do and choosing not to do it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. Austin, one of the ways in which our society is configured, and one of the structures, is that we only listen to youth and pay attention to youth when they kind of force themselves on our consciousness. And that's been happening recently. These last few years, we've seen growth in youth activism. But your essay really calls for us to move beyond these kind of moments, these surges of youth activism, to say, how do we build leadership and infrastructure with youth leadership that can be sustained? And I'd love for you to talk some more about how you see the role of youth activism and that shifting into infrastructure.
Absolutely. Such an honor to be with you. I did not know Harold personally, but when I heard Mark say that this was his mentor, I know what that means, because I've been mentored by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee over the last 10 years, and it's transformed my life. And so I take the mentor-mentee relationship as sacred in the human experience. And so I'm really honored to have been able to support this. And I'll say, I want to pick up where Tony left off, which is he said that, you know, people take these systems and structures as given. And what's unique about young people, it's not their youthfulness, it's their newness. And because they are newer to these structures and systems, they are less likely to take them as given. And so they question everything. And that's what makes them at the center of all of these social movements. It's their newness, not their youthfulness. And there's three capacities. Well, let me take a step back. I think we all agree that when we hear from Sandra, Tony, and we hear from my brother Michael, that the problem isn't a lack of ideas. I think we know the ideas. Many need to know them more. The problem is that the people who make decisions, to your point, Tony, it is up to their choice, and they're not making the choices, and they don't feel the pressure that's necessary. And so protest movements become a critical way in which we sustain pressure on decision makers to make change. Young people at the tip of the spear for those, but there's an ebb and a flow in the way that that pressure is sustained over time. So in a flow period like 24 million people in the streets 2 summers ago in 2020, we saw massive pressure, some systemic change, and yet we didn't see it fully realized. We're in an ebb period right now. And to answer your question, Mark, there are 3 capacities that are necessary to sustain this youthful movement, energy, and pressure in an ebb period. The first is we need the capacity for training. So we had millions of people in the streets, all on their own agendas, but united around a common problem. We need mass training capacity to be able to absorb people through a train-the-trainer program, particularly young people, around a set of strategic objectives and goals, and a theory of change that understands we're in a flow period. When we're in an ebb, we must continue this enthusiasm and activism and civic engagement in other arenas. So that's the first key capacity. The second key capacity, other than training, is the capacity of organizations to absorb people. So name an organization and bring them to your mind right now. Are they bigger now than they were when 24 million people took the streets? I would say 80% probably are not bigger today. And that is a question for all of us, is why not? Why aren't our nonprofit organizations, to Michael's call earlier, or other forms of organizations like churches, which were central in the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle, why are we not able to absorb at least tens of thousands of people in these movement moments so that in ebb periods we can sustain that energy and enthusiasm in other domains? That question we could dig into. I have some hypotheses, but we need to build that capacity to absorb. And then the third is we've seen the ways in which in these flow periods we're able to shift narrative. But if you look at Policy Link's most recent polling and surveying, it suggests that as we've left the flow period and went into this period of ebb, we've seen the American public change their minds about racial inequities in this country. And so we need a third capacity in our movement ecosystem, which is how to sustain message and narrative, particularly to combat and inoculate the American people against the extremist, racist maneuvers that are being made to mold minds against the kinds of systemic change that Sandra, Tony, and Michael have talked about. So to answer your question directly, it's building those 3 capacities, Mark, and I talk about in the essay specifically about civic engagement as what to do in these ebb periods to channel that enthusiasm and momentum. But without those 3 capacities, we're going to go into another flow period in 2023, which I think we will, without being ready for that moment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Austin. You know, another way to think about capacity is power. And I want to shift to a discussion of power now. And Tony, you said as Americans, we don't think about structure. We don't see structure. And I think we also don't like to talk about power and name power. But one thing I'm excited about in your essays is all of you went right to that and have named power as essential. If we are serious about fundamental systemic change in society, then we're going to have to be about power building. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And Tony, maybe to come to you, because at the California Endowment, you've just come out of a multi-year initiative that I think at the outset probably didn't name power in as clear a way as you named it midway through and at the outset, at the end of it. And so I think there's been some real lessons learned about how you help reveal power, shift power, build power out of what you and your colleagues have been doing. And your essay calls for a democratic approach, not a technocratic, a power approach, not a program approach. And I'd love for you to say a little bit about what you learned out at TCE.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I'll try to be brief, but you may have to cut me off, my friend, because I could just go on about this. First, I want to point to Frank Farrow as being kind of our savant who helped guide us through this process, from sort of recognizing that power was important in this sort of almost mechanistic way. You know, we thought of health as sort of like the product of good policy. And therefore, in order to change policy, we needed to invest in a tool. That tool was power to participate politically, to be able to engage policymakers, to inform and shape policy priorities. So power was seen as largely as sort of like a tool towards a policy change end. And in the midst of our work, and you know, we're the largest health foundation in California, and we're radical in the sense that we define health quite broadly. And this is part of why power was so interesting to us. In the midst of our work, we started to recognize, well, you know, power is more than just a tool. You know, at the end of the day, those policy changes are vulnerable if they're just sort of left out there to hang and be implemented by systems and powerful actors who have essentially a mindset about who deserves, who belongs, where resources should be skewed. And so we started to think maybe our work is less of power as a means to a policy end, but power as an end in and of itself. And a policy may have been even more of a means to a power end. And so that was a sort of a radical change for us. Although quite frankly, we were iterating towards that throughout the entire decade we were doing our work. Now, when I say democratic versus technocratic, you know, we're a health foundation, and health in this country, it's impossible for people to talk about health without talking about healthcare. And so healthcare becomes the dominant sort of paradigm for discussing health, when in fact, healthcare is such a small piece of health. It's actually been quantified. It's less than 10% of the health status of a population. Yet we spend all of our time talking about who's going to pay for insurance. You know, how are the pharmaceutical manufacturers going to be reimbursed for their innovation? And we don't talk about essentially fundamentally what actually creates health in community. And what we learned, and I'm boiling it down, is that what creates health in community boils down to ABC. A stands for agency, which is just power. And it's power, disproportionately power at the community level. The ability for communities to hold systems accountable for equitable outcomes. That's absolutely critical. The B stands for belonging. And belonging is, in our minds, is really kind of the opposite of racism. It's the ability to have your story known, your voice heard, to be seen, and to be considered a full human being. And then the C is really about the difference between programs and fundamental transformative change. It's the idea that it's the conditions of opportunity that drive health. It's not the absence of healthcare or the absence of some sort of technocratic program. So we boil down everything that we do into this sort of very simple scheme of agency, belonging, and addressing fundamental conditions. And that's, to our minds, worth the almost $2 billion we spent over the past decade, and the $2 billion we'll spend in the next decade, with a laser focus on those things because of, in part, large part, because of the guidance of Frank Farrow and some other folks that helped us realize that that's in fact what we needed to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. And I'm sure that generated dozens of questions for all of us. There are beautiful reports written. Frank Farrow has been involved in those. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more about this, there's plenty to be learned and available online. I'm going to ask Sandra and then Austin a couple demographic questions about power. And then Michael, I'm going to have you back clean up on this power, because I know there's a number of directions you can go in with this one. Sandra, you talk and your organization is very focused on parent power as one of the key powers. And could you just take a moment, tell us a little bit about what you've learned and how you think about parent power?
Yeah, and actually, Mark, it's community, parent, and youth power. But when we first started, and what we had done for years was we did parent engagement. How do we engage parents, you know, in the work of ending structural racism and gaining power and getting policies passed? And it was kind of more, I think, of what Tony was saying, like power was the ends to something else instead of being the end itself. And that really, I didn't use that language, Tony, thank you very much. But that really is how we've shifted. It's like, you know, we're not like using them to get something, they are it. Right? So they have agency. Our community has agency. And 74% of our families make $30,000 or less, largely African-American, right? And so once we start shifting from engagement, right, for us, for our language, and saying, like, for example, our parent group is called, used to be Parent Advisory Board, right? Don't we all call them parent advisory boards, right? And now we say Parents in Power, PNP. Right. So, and what we're about is really what Austin was talking about. We've really shifted to how do we build on what they already bring, that they are already inherently powerful in the training, the opportunities, the exposure. And we have parents, for example, doing statewide training. It rocks when you get a bunch of parents together across a geography and they start saying, man, you know, y'all poor over there too, and you're poor over there too. And what's to say, what's up with this system? You know, and so it has been a radical transformation for us. And again, the George Floyd, COVID, violence, all of that really opened our eyes because our youth were demonstrating their power. Our parents were demonstrating their power. And so it is equipping them. And Frank said something when he said Harold would sometimes see in his mentees what they didn't see yet. So that's the other thing. We got a lot of folks here who are powerful and don't know it. And so we got to like just keep holding up a mirror by the things that we do to support the kind of burgeoning of that aspect of their efficacy.
Thank you, Sandra. Austin, I want to come to you for a little real talk right now, because Sandra talks about the positive side, which would be seeing youth step into power and seeing what they might not even see themselves. But we all know one of the challenges is that often when youth are stepping into power, those adults who have the power maybe aren't quite ready yet to give up that power. And so what I love about your essay is you say, look, it's not an either or. There's newness from the youth and there's wisdom from the elders, and we need both. But that doesn't always play out like that on the ground, especially from the youth. I can speak from personal experience with my three youth and how they want to kind of take the next moment. So Austin, can you talk just a word about that blending for intergenerational power?
And I'll be very concrete because I know we're coming up on time. We need skilled facilitators, thousands and thousands, because to hold the polarity between drawing from the wisdom of people who've been around for a while, seasoned, and to hold the newness and insight and boldness of newer generations, it is a skill set. It's not innate. And so having facilitators who can hold these intergenerational conversations and spaces and equip others to utilize the Socratic method is critical. And I think there's two opportunities to focus on. Is we need to provide space for young people to have autonomy. And at the same time, we need to hold space for young people to build core competencies. And we can't have autonomy and not have core competency, and we cannot have core competency and not have autonomy, because It's going to be very difficult to wield power and to govern, to self-govern, if you can't run an effective meeting. So we need to have a core competency with young people of being able to run an effective meeting, and at the same time, they do need the autonomy. And I think facilitators who can hold those intergenerational spaces are more vital now than ever.
Beautiful. Michael, I'm gonna give you the floor to go where you want to. One thing to touch on, because you call in your essay for leaders to, quote, fully exercise their power. And what I like is you point the mirror back to themselves. And you talk about what you call mental mastery. We have to master our own mind. This is not just about pointing the fingers to others. So if you could touch on that, and then wherever you'd like to go based on what you've been hearing. And can you come off mute, Michael?
You know, when I think of that, I think about the gift that I've had to, you know, be mentored by folks like Frank and Angela and Jeff Canada and others. And I've always watched them use their power in their own way. Very different personalities, very different styles, but they used it nonetheless. And so for me, that's the only thing that I think I exist for in this role, which is to think about that, but also think about it in terms of what's the generational work. And you hear all of us talking about what's the work for our generation. It's not for me to sit in this seat and get enriched and kind of play at being a CEO of an intermediary that can just put out some reports and do some convenings and things like that and get away with it. It is actually to push the limits of what does it mean to suffer loss, to be of service. And for me, that means that there are just some things I'm not going to tolerate. Like someone asked me the other day, well, you know, how do you make the case for the business case for, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion? I don't make those damn cases anymore. I don't need to make the case to see your humanity. That's your cross to bear. That's not my cross to bear. My cross is the cross of inclusion. It's not exclusion. And to show up with that strength to be able to be respectful, but to acknowledge that's not my work, that's your work. I don't even have to answer to it anymore. And I don't have to answer to it anymore because Angela and Frank and Tony and others have already paid the price for that. That's not my fight. My fight is to get about the work that you heard me describe and you hear my colleagues describing, to be unapologetic about the type of nation that we want, unapologetic about using our voice as power, using our intellect as power, quite frankly, using our humility as power, of the ability for us to abandon ourselves to the strengths of each other, to get into different types of relationships so that we can do the work for our generation. So at this moment, what power means for me is I have absolutely no fear of when that day comes that I lose this job. And that day will come. The only thing that matters is if I lose it, did I lose it responsibly? And did I lose it being of service? And that is a wonderful place to be in when you know that the strengths of your ancestors runs through your veins, and you don't just use those as a cute, flowery statement, but it shows up in the strength of your spine, right? And that's what I care about right now. And the last thing I'll say about power is this. As the CEO of Policy Link, I'm authorized to do a whole lot already. And so to Austin's point, what I'm most authorized to do is to create an organization where other people can join and come across that imaginary threshold every day and bring their full selves to the enterprise of liberating all people in this nation. And that is the ultimate gift that Harold and Frank and others have taught me. If we don't have strong, capable institutions, we can't win on equity. And so power for me not only is about how I show up in the world as a signal to others, it is also about the legacy of the institution that I continue to build, that builds off of Angela's legacy, but as an institution where people don't have to come to work and fight about whether we're going to help poor white folks. They know that that's the work. It's as fundamental as reading and writing. They understand that I want you to be respectful, but disruptive. And that I want you to understand that if you're going to do this work, we all must come to grips with suffering loss. And to me, that is the most beautiful form of power for me, to call how I'm going to come into this game and how I'm going to go out of it. And that's all I have left in my life right now to do, which is just to deliver on results for that 100 million that are struggling. And that is me being in, as Austin said, flow. And we'll see where it goes. Who knows where it goes? But what I do know, when it's all said and done, I know that I have served well.
No doubt. Love it, Michael. Thank you. Let me close us out with a little complete the sentence exercise. So we've called this volume Passing the Baton, and I would love for each of you to complete this sentence. Passing the baton effectively means ... Passing the baton effectively means ... And Brother Austin, I'm going to start with you. Passing the baton effectively means...
Coaching.
Right. Passing the baton effectively means coaching. Tony, let's come to you. Passing the baton effectively.
For me, it means helping inculcate in the next generation the power of narrative, the power of story, the power of values. And I think we've gotten twisted up around policy as this sort of exalted goal, when in fact it's the fundamental story of who belongs that drives all policy, and that policy creates conditions. So it's about the power of reclaiming that narrative of who belongs and who we are.
The power of narrative, the power of values. Thank you, Tony. Sandra, passing the baton effectively.
Yeah, we had a Black History Month singer yesterday, and she sang Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black. And and I said, you know, I've never heard a white child sing Young, Gifted, and White. It may start happening now, given how our country's going. But for me, the name of the game is for us to never have to sing that song. For Black kids to just know that they know that they're gifted.
Thank you, Sandra. Michael, passing the baton effectively.
Passing the baton effectively means that we have modeled that love is power, and manifesting is the final frontier of the work that we've got to do to bring about all the things that we want to see in the world.
Love is power, and let us manifest that. Beautiful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We could go on for 2 hours, and I bet everyone would stay to hear it. And please, I encourage everyone to check out the essays, contact the authors, check out their organizations. And with that, we are going to have some open mic time because we'd like to hear some reactions and from some others. Please join me in thanking our authors. We can do a Zoom set of applause so they can see our appreciation. That was fabulous, and we really appreciate your time. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Frank.